In the middle of a tense courtroom in Brooklyn, where the fate of a 72-year-old woman hangs by a thread, resting solely on a few pages of damning accusations, an 8-year-old boy suddenly stands up, clutching a messy stack of papers marked with colored tabs. "Your Honor, I would like to speak to defend my grandmother." The entire courtroom falls dead silent. The judge pauses mid-sentence. Jurors exchange stunned glances. What they didn't know was that this moment would mark the beginning of a legal storm unlike anything ever seen, where a child wouldn't just speak the truth, but force an entire justice system to reckon with it. This is a true story about Nicholas Johnson, the 8-year-old boy who dared to stand up against a corrupt prosecutor to save his grandmother from a wrongful conviction. And he did it with the one weapon no one expected: the truth. Judge William Carter stopped writing and looked up over his glasses. In his 30 years on the bench, he had never seen anything like this. At the jury box, several members glanced around, expressions shifting from confusion to curiosity. Dorothy Johnson, age 72, was being charged with embezzlement, accused of siphoning funds from a community housing program in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which she had run for 15 years. The missing amount, a staggering $175,000 money that had seemingly vanished from the books. "You should be in school right now, not here," the judge said, offering a half-smile at the unusual sight. "I know, Sir," Nicholas replied, "but my grandma has a heart condition. She can't handle stress. Her lawyer quit the case yesterday because he knew she couldn't afford to pay." The boy's voice rang out with a composure so calm, so clear, it unsettled the room. A murmur rippled through the crowd. David Richardson, the prosecutor on the case, rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed. The man in his early 50s was infamous for his 95% conviction rate in financial fraud cases. "Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate. A child cannot legally represent the defendant." Richardson snapped, adjusting his expensive tie with barely concealed disdain. "I'm not representing anyone, sir." Nicholas turned to the prosecutor, his voice disarmingly polite. "I just want to tell the truth. My grandma taught me that the truth always wins, even when it seems impossible." Judge Carter leaned forward, unexpectedly drawn in. There was something in the boy's steady gaze that moved him. And yet beneath that was a grim awareness. Every eye in the room was watching a young black child trying to navigate a system that had rarely worked in favor of kids like him. "All right, Nicholas," the judge finally said. "You have 5 minutes. You may speak, but only as a witness." Ignoring the prosecutor's silent protest, the judge gave a small nod. Nicholas took a deep breath and opened the file. The papers inside were shockingly well organized, catching everyone's attention. There were newspaper clippings, photocopies of official documents, even hand-drawn illustrations he'd made to highlight key points. "Your Honor, I've lived with my grandma since my parents died in a car accident 2 years ago. She runs the housing program, and every Sunday night we check the invoices together at the kitchen table." Prosecutor Richardson looked like he was about to object again, but hesitated. There was something in the boy's voice and his eyes that said he knew exactly what he was doing. "Every Sunday, Grandma Dorothy lays out all the paperwork, and I help sort the receipts by color: blue for expenses, yellow for income. That's our special time together." Nicholas continued, his voice starting to waver, but he caught himself steadying with resolve. The entire courtroom looked at the boy with a mix of pity and skepticism. But Nicholas didn't act like a desperate child trying to save a loved one. He stood like someone far older, someone who had weathered much greater storms and understood one thing: true strength isn't loud, it acts. Richardson couldn't hide his contempt. To him, this was nothing more than a cheap, emotional performance, a black kid trying to defend his crooked grandmother. In September, 3 weeks before the funds disappeared, Nicholas said, "Holding up a school notebook, my grandmother discovered that the housing program account had been accessed without permission." He lifted the notebook. "She wrote everything down in here." Richardson shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We're wasting time on the imagination of a child clearly coached by the defendant." Nicholas turned to him, still polite. "Mr. Richardson, you may respond after I finish. My grandmother always taught me a respectful person listens before they speak." The truth in that room was far more complicated than it seemed. Dorothy Johnson had spent 15 years running a housing program for low-income families in Brooklyn, not for a salary, but because she believed every child deserved a decent home. When Nicholas lost both parents in a car accident caused by a drunk driver after the school's music recital, Dorothy didn't hesitate for a second. She took him in. Nicholas was devastated, even blamed himself. He didn't speak for months. Dorothy sat by his bed every night reading aloud legal briefs, court transcripts, anything she brought home from her volunteer work, helping neighbors resolve disputes. "My grandson," she would say, "knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you. When you understand how the world works, you'll never feel small again." Nicholas started paying attention. He asked about legal terms, about court procedures. Dorothy soon realized her grandson had an exceptional memory and a natural instinct for the law, one that would surprise even seasoned attorneys. "Your Honor," Nicholas brought everyone back to the present. "I would like to present some evidence." Richardson scoffed. "Is this circus still going?" But Nicholas didn't flinch. He walked toward the judge's bench, his gaze calm and steady, a kind of confidence only people who have lost too much can carry. On September 12th, $2,500 was withdrawn for repairs to the community center's roof, he said. "But the next day my grandmother took me there, the roof hadn't been touched." He held up a photo taken on an old phone. This was taken on September 13th. No patchwork, no materials on site. Richardson began to fidget. His whole case had rested on Dorothy's technical role. She was the one managing finances, but he had never examined each transaction closely. On September 18th, Nicholas continued. $1,800 was spent on new security equipment. But no new system was installed. And then came the most suspicious charge on September 25th, $3,200 for outside legal services. He paused, scanning the room. "But my grandmother never hired outside lawyers. She always handled things with help from her friends' attorneys who volunteered their time." In the jury box, people began to lean forward. Curiosity had shifted into genuine interest. Something very real was unfolding. Nicholas turned back to the prosecutor. "Mr. Richardson, did you verify whether the companies receiving those payments actually exist?" Richardson was speechless. It was a simple question, yet one he'd never considered. "The investigation focused solely on administrative responsibility," he said, as if defending himself. "I see," Nicholas replied calmly. "So you assumed my grandmother was guilty without even investigating who actually stole the money." Each of Nicholas's questions exposed a new crack in Richardson's investigation. The man slowly began to realize he had completely misjudged the situation, building an entire case off a prejudice against an elderly black woman managing public funds. But what he didn't know was this: Nicholas's questions weren't random, nor were they childlike guesses. For 2 straight months, the boy had been meticulously studying every detail of the case, not just out of love for his grandmother, but from a deep belief that the system would crush any innocent black family if no one stood up. "There's something very strange about these transactions," Nicholas continued, pulling another envelope from his bag. "They all bear my grandmother's signature, but she never signed a single one." His hands trembled slightly as he held up the documents. Not from fear, but from the weight of the truth he was about to reveal. "I studied handwriting analysis at the public library. Even a kid like me can tell they're totally different. This is her real signature, soft, rounded strokes. And they're forged, heavy, jagged, pressed too hard." Richardson rolled his eyes, clearly mocking. "So now we're accepting handwriting analysis from a child." "This is ridiculous, Mr. Richardson," Nicholas replied, his voice polite but ice cold. "Do you have any expert analysis proving the signatures are real?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Richardson stammered once again without an answer. "So you have no evidence that my grandmother actually signed those documents?" Nicholas's voice remained calm, like someone who already knew he had won. And, in truth, he had. For the past 2 months since learning of the charges against his grandmother, Nicholas had turned every evening into a mock trial. But he wasn't alone. Mrs. Patricia Williams, a retired librarian who had once worked as a legal assistant, was the quiet mentor behind every strategy. When Nicholas first came into the library, asking for books on courtroom procedures, she saw in him something most adults lacked: razor-sharp logic and a heart that refused to be broken. "Nicholas," she once told him, "you have a mind made for the law, but you'll need to be smarter than all of them." Because they'll try to dismiss you for one reason: you're a child. Together, they mapped everything out: the order of evidence, how to frame questions that expose flaws, how to stay composed when adults tried to belittle him. But the most important piece of evidence is this: Nicholas raised a bank document. It shows that on the day the money went missing, a phone call was made to the bank at 2:30 p.m. The call lasted 15 minutes. He pulled out another sheet. This is the Brooklyn Methodist Hospital record. My grandmother was in the emergency room with me from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. that day. I had an asthma attack. She was right there the whole time. A loud gasp rippled through the courtroom. This was it, the first solid, irrefutable proof that Dorothy could not have made the financial transaction. Richardson leapt to his feet in panic. "Your Honor, these documents were not part of the discovery process, Mr. Richardson," Nicholas replied, still composed. "Can you provide any evidence placing my grandmother at the scene when the money was stolen?" Silence. Once again. Nicholas calmly. "So did you check the security cameras at the housing program building?" Richardson starts sweating. Richardson stammering. "The cameras that day weren't functioning." Nicholas tilting his head with innocent sarcasm. "Really, I called the security company last week. They said the cameras were working just fine. They even offered to provide the footage for free just to help my grandma." The room erupts into whispers. Richardson is being torn apart by an 8-year-old piece by piece, flaw by flaw, Richardson's voice cracking from panic and anger. "How did you even get all this information, Nicholas Steady? That's easy, sir. When you love someone, you do everything you can to protect them. For the past 2 months, after every school day, I've been studying this case." Dorothy, who had been silent the whole time, begins to cry. Her 8-year-old grandson, the child who hadn't spoken a word in months, is now standing here fighting for her with a strength she never imagined. Judge Carter. Leaning forward moved Nicholas. "How did you learn how to organize evidence like this?" Nicholas gently. "Miss Patricia at the library taught me. She worked in a law office for 30 years. She said everyone deserves protection, even if they can't afford a lawyer." The jury sits frozen. Richardson, once supremely confident, begins to realize this isn't a panicked child. This is a legal strategist duo he badly underestimated. Nicholas' voice turning sharp. "But I have one last piece of evidence, the most important one." He pulls out a sealed envelope. "Nicholas, in here is proof of who actually stole money from the housing program. My grandma and I found it, but we wanted to give the person a chance to confess." He turns, locking eyes with Richardson. "Nicholas Firm, would you like to withdraw your charges against my grandma before I open this envelope?" Richardson hesitates. His career was built on always being right. But now he stands on the edge of having accused an innocent woman driven by bias and negligence. The room holds its breath. Anyone watching closely would see Nicholas's hand is shaking, but not from fear, from the weight of power being held back. Not the power of age or title, but of truth and love. Richardson trembles, sweat beads on his forehead. Richardson weakly forcing defiance. "No, I can't drop the charges. Just because a kid tries to intimidate me." Nicholas says nothing. He calmly opens the envelope, pulls out a small voice recorder, and looks straight at Richardson. Nicholas deadpan, "Dr. Richardson, do you remember the phone call on September 15th? He presses play. The room freezes. Then Richardson's unmistakable voice echoes loud and clear. "Tony, I need you to fast-track that case on the old welfare lady. Guilt doesn't matter. I need to keep my conviction numbers up before the Attorney General election." A gasp exploded through the room. The courtroom fell so silent you could hear someone swallow. Then another man's voice rang out from the recording. "Rick, are you sure? If they find out we didn't run a proper investigation, who's going to find out? Some poor black old lady up against me." The jury made up their minds before even stepping into the courtroom. The entire jury collectively widened their eyes, shocked and outraged. Some covered their mouths. Others turned away, as if unable to believe what they were hearing. Richardson turned pale lips, trembling, suddenly realizing that his career and the political life he had so carefully constructed had just crumbled in a matter of seconds. "This recording is inadmissible," he shouted, struggling to stay afloat. This is an illegal wiretap." Nicholas remained perfectly calm. "No, sir," he replied. "Mrs. Patricia taught me about recording laws. This call was made from a public office phone right next to a sign clearly stating that all calls may be recorded for administrative transparency." Judge Carter sat upright, his face stunned. In 30 years on the bench, he had never seen such a dramatic takedown, let alone by an 8-year-old child. "Dr. Richardson," Nicholas continued, "do you also remember the message you sent Tony 3 days after that call?" He held up a printed screenshot of the text message. "Focus the investigation on administrative oversight by the supervisor. No need to waste time checking the company or signature. Close the case in 2 weeks." The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Jurors turned to look at each other, faces twisted in disgust. This wasn't just negligence, it was calculated corruption. And Nicholas wasn't finished. "The most important evidence," he said, raising a printed bank statement, "is right here. This is Dr. Richardson's personal account statement. On October 2nd, 3 days after my grandmother was indicted, he received a wire transfer of $25,000 from a shell company." Richardson's mouth twitched. That's not the same company that received funds from the housing program through fraudulent transactions," Nicholas said firmly. "You didn't just overlook evidence, Dr. Richardson. You shielded your accomplices." The courtroom burst into shouts and shocked whispers. Richardson, a prosecutor once known for his zero-tolerance stance, now looked no different from a criminal caught red-handed in court. Nicholas looked at him not with anger but with quiet sorrow. "Mrs. Patricia taught me one important thing," he said, "that people like you always make the same mistake, thinking you can trample on the weak without ever having to pay the price." Dorothy, who had remained silent the entire time, quietly rose to her feet. Her voice rang out heavy with conviction and pain. "Dr. Richardson, I spent 15 years of my life helping poor families get decent housing. And you tried to destroy it all. For power and money." Richardson hung his head. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to defend. Judge Carter's voice, trembling with emotion, finally spoke. "Nicholas, in all my 30 years on this bench, I have never seen a presentation of evidence this thorough. I didn't do this to win," Sir Nicholas replied. "I did this to clear my grandmother's name, and to make sure justice was truly served." Carter turned to Richardson. "All charges against Mrs. Dorothy Johnson are hereby dismissed, and I order the case file to be submitted for formal investigation into Mr. Richardson's misconduct and corruption." Richardson tried to rise in protest, but staggered as if the weight of his downfall was too much to bear. The proud figure he once was, now reduced to sheer panic and disgrace. Nicholas turned to face the entire courtroom. His voice was firm yet gentle. "Your Honor, I didn't do this for revenge. I did it because I love my grandmother, and because I believe every child deserves to know that justice is real, even when it seems impossible." Applause broke out first from a single juror, then from the entire courtroom. Many were crying, not just because Dorothy had been vindicated, but because they had just witnessed a real-life miracle. 6 months after the trial that shook all of Brooklyn, Nicholas sat in the front row of one of the city's most prestigious law schools. But this time, he wasn't a student. He was the keynote speaker. At just 9 years old, Nicholas had become one of the most cited case studies in civil procedure classes over the past decade. In front of more than 300 law students, he began his speech with the same quiet sincerity that had once moved a courtroom. "Justice doesn't happen when you defeat someone. It happens when you protect the ones you love, and inspire others to do the right thing too." In the front row, Mrs. Dorothy beamed with pride. Her health had improved significantly since the case was resolved. The housing program she had once overseen was now under transparent management, and had even received a record-breaking wave of donations from people touched by the Johnson family's story. And as for Richardson, his fate couldn't have been more different. A federal investigation concluded decisively: corruption, abuse of prosecutorial power, fraud. He lost his law license, served a 2-year prison sentence, and eventually found work at a low-level insurance agency in a distant town, a place where no one knew the shame of his past. Many people asked Nicholas, "Do you feel sorry for him?" The boy thought for a moment, then answered honestly, his voice clear and sincere, "I do. I feel sorry for someone who had so much privilege, but chose to use it to hurt the innocent." Ms. Patricia, the librarian who had become Nicholas's official mentor through a university outreach program, was also present during the public talk. Together, they founded the Nicholas Project, a basic legal education initiative for children in underserved communities. Currently, the Nicholas Project is running in 25 public schools across Brooklyn, teaching hundreds of students that they have a voice and a right to understand how the law is meant to protect them. Nicholas taught us something fundamental, the dean of the law school said during the event. That knowledge without ethics is dangerous. But ethics paired with knowledge can change the world. Nicholas's life changed completely too. 3 of New York's top law firms offered him full scholarships once he reaches college age. National media covered his case widely, but Ms. Dorothy always shielded her grandson from the public eye so he could live like a normal child. Play basketball on the school court, watch cartoons on Sundays, argue with friends over the last piece of candy. More importantly, his story sparked real legal change. The state of New York passed the Nicholas Act requiring prosecutors to provide clear evidence of a defendant's physical presence at the scene in public fund abuse cases. Several other states began considering similar legislation. At a university seminar, a young woman raised her hand and asked Nicholas, "Do you think you'll become a lawyer one day?" The boy smiled and answered with the same familiar honesty, "I'm not sure. But I know I want to keep helping people to understand they have more power than they think." Ms. Dorothy, now honored as a distinguished citizen of Brooklyn, used her new platform to campaign for reforms in the social welfare system. She was appointed to the Oversight Board for Community Assistance Programs, where she championed transparency and effectiveness, the very things Richardson once dismissed. "My grandson taught me that wisdom isn't determined by age," she said on national television. "And capability isn't determined by skin color. Sometimes justice needs to be reminded of its own principles." Richardson tried several times to reach Dorothy from prison, sending letters of apology. But she never replied. It wasn't out of hatred, she had simply moved past it all. "There are wounds," she once told Nicholas, "that don't need forgiveness to heal. They just need justice. And we have justice now, my dear." In the courtroom where the historic trial had taken place, Judge Carter quietly framed a photo from that day and placed it on his desk. A photo of a young black boy standing in the center of the courtroom file, in hand, eyes blazing with integrity. From that day forward, the judge became more meticulous with every case he oversaw, often referring to the Johnson precedent as both a legal and moral compass. As for Nicholas, he remained a regular kid but carried within him a rare, extraordinary maturity. He would often accompany Grandma Dorothy on housing advocacy trips across cities, always carrying the file that had become iconic, now widely studied among law students. A journalist once asked him during a visit, "What's the biggest lesson you learned from the trial?" Nicholas didn't hesitate. "I learned that if you're right and you don't give up, the legal system can still be fair. But you have to be ready to prove it." Sitting behind him, Mrs. Patricia whispered softly, "That boy didn't just save his grandmother. He restored my faith in the next generation, that maybe they can fix what we've done wrong." The Johnson case became a landmark in American legal history. Lawyers began citing Nicholas versus State in cases of wrongful investigation. Law schools added the case to ethics modules in their curriculum. Nicholas was often asked how he avoided becoming a victim of injustice, and he always answered with what Dorothy had taught him. "The difference between a victim and a victor isn't what happens to you, it's what you choose to do next." She told me knowledge is power, but love is courage. Richardson had tried to destroy an innocent family, but in the end, he destroyed only himself. Meanwhile, Nicholas and Dorothy rose above it all, becoming an inspiration for an entire generation, one that now believes age does not determine ability. Skin color does not define potential. And when love walks hand in hand with knowledge, miracles are absolutely possible. Don't forget to like this video if you believe justice can begin with even the smallest actions. Subscribe so you won't miss more true, emotional, and inspiring stories like this. Comment below if you've ever stood up to protect someone you love, even when no one believed you.